Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming, and I'm really happy to be here. My name is Annabelle Daou, and I'm going to speak probably about the past 10-15 years of my work. So I'm going to begin with a few lines from a poem by a poet named George Oppen, from a poem called Of Being Numerous. Obsessed, bewildered by the shipwreck of the singular, we have chosen the meaning of being numerous. These lines come from a poem that he wrote in 1968. Until 2003, I used to be a painter, which is where I live. I grew up in Lebanon, born and grew up in Lebanon. I live in the US, and in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq, I felt like it was such a meaningless time. I felt like language had no meaning. And I was reading George Oppen at the time, and he said, in 1935, when World War II, he gave up writing for 20 years, and he said, "Surely there are situations in which it's absurd to write poetry. One could approach one's own death with poetry. I should think one would. But a slaughter for which one bears perhaps some responsibility, or he does what he does, I don't know what one should do." So for me, that sense echoed with what I was feeling at the time, which is, how can we make art in a time of such violence? And so I decided to throw away all my paints and do something else. And of course, I ended up not knowing how to do anything else because I'd been doing this for 20 years. So instead, I picked up a pencil and I started writing work. One of my early works is a piece called America. The piece is quite large. It's 10 feet by 13 feet. This is all text written in pencil. I started reading things that I had never read before, poems, music, different aspects of American society. The top is the entire Bible that Thomas Jefferson, before he died, took the Bible and cut all the miracles out of it to make it a philosophical treatise on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. And he did it because he thought Christianity was going to be used badly by the Americans. And so I transcribed the entire Bible on the top. And you can see how there are poems, there's the CIA fact sheet on the United States, there's George Washington's address to go to war, there's the name of all the fireworks, there's the name of every roller coaster. Basically, I was trying to read America for myself. I was trying to find a way to describe a place, but also to think about sound of a place. So in the center also, at the time, Israel was bombing Lebanon, so I was picking up the news every day and putting the news into the center of the piece. You can see from this detail, but the piece is so large, so I mean, there's 150 different texts in it. I was really thinking about who tells the stories of a country, who has the right to tell the story, what is the sound of a place. In 2010, I was invited to represent the United States at the Cairo Biennial. I decided to travel between Beirut and New York, asking people. I would just stop people and ask them, where are you coming from? Where are you going to? And then I would record their answers. And so the sound piece plays along with this, and you hear people responding where they're coming from. And what I was trying to do with that is I was thinking about the way people will ask you, where are you from? In order to try to me, it's always about difference. It's always about saying, you're not me. And so I was thinking about that notion of like, why is it this thing that we always have to place ourselves in opposition to the other? So I was asking the question, where are you coming from? Where are you going? And people were like, from my grandmother's house, from the bus, from the theater. That was the first time that I started asking people questions in the street and recording them. This is the second time. I walked through the streets of New York in 2012, and I would just walk up to people and I'd say, can I ask you a question? They'd say yes often, and I'd say, which side are you on? And they didn't really know what it was about or whatever, but they would answer spontaneously. And so I took their responses. Which side are you on?
Your side.
The upside. I'm with the underdogs.
Which side are you on?
For the others. the women's side.
Clearly not the majority.
Which side are you on?
It's very hard to choose right and wrong.
Not on the side of war.
The radical.
Like, oh, I'm on the inside or the outside.
Which side are you on?
I just said there's no two sides. There's many, many voices to be heard.
Which side are you on?
The side of love.
The right side, the good side. This, that, or the other.
Which side are you on?
Both sides.
The right side.
That's a very big question.
So this is a portion of the responses. It was really interesting because I had been thinking about which side of the screen are we on. And so I bought this old 1980s television and filmed a confessional screen. And so the sound plays from this television. But what was really interesting is I decided to do this piece, and I was walking through the streets of downtown New York, and I hadn't really been thinking. It was during Occupy Wall Street. I would ask people, and they would, you can hear very often people would say, I'm on the right side. And then I'd walk away and they'd say, no, I'm on the left side actually, because they'd realized that they were talking about, politics. And it was really interesting though, because they closed down Occupy while I was making the piece. And immediately when I would ask people the question, they would say something. Until then, they kept feeling it was a political question. After that, they'd start talking about the football game and who was going to win the football game and which side of the football game. It made it really interesting to think about how at a given moment in the street, we're all on a certain kind of wavelength, even if just subconsciously, It was so quick how it changed. So these were the first times I started thinking about the way of being in the street as an artist. So during this period, I began thinking about the accumulation of voices, of language as a way to mark a sense of being in the same place with others. The idea of power, of repetition as a marker of being. And also forms of engagement that I could bring into my performative practice that had something to do with the street and public space. It was during this time that I became interested in the idea of fortune tellers. I've almost never been to a fortune teller myself. I don't know what I really think about them. But I started to think about the idea of the fortune teller as a stand-in for the artist. Fortune tellers are gendered, for one thing. They're also othered. Fortune telling is ubiquitous in urban life, even though it's illegal in many places, including in New York City. You can be a psychic, but you can't be a fortune teller. But I started to think of it as a stand-in for an artist, someone who looks at the present in order to see the past and project the future. Someone who holds some power, but who's also a hustler and a seducer, calling you over to put your hands out, to pay them, and also to give some part of yourself, to get something you want. Considered in the social and historical context, the figure of the fortune teller raises questions about superstition, belief, class, gender, and cross-cultural interaction. The fortune teller is at once a subject of suspicion and someone in whom trust is precariously placed. So it's interesting, I found with fortune telling is people can be very suspicious and they don't necessarily trust this woman in the street who's trying to say, but then when you sit down, you really think this person is going to tell you if you're going to live, die, fall in love, have children, the most important things in life, you somehow put in the hands of somebody that you're not sure you trust. So I began this project of becoming a fortune teller. I began it at PS1 MoMA. I thought it would be a kind of performance. It's a silent performance where people are invited to come sit in front of me and they pay me. I charge for this because it's labor and because there's a power dynamic. When you pay for something, you expect something, and the person doing it feels like they have to be in that role. So it's entirely silent. I take the money. People sit opposite me, I take a piece of paper and I write a line of text for a line in their hands. And it moves around two lines, where are you coming from and where are you going to? So I've done it now in so many places and for so many years. I began in 2013. Since it's silent, there's a certain moment between me and this person, and since I end up doing usually about 4 hours like this, and it's about 5 to 10 minutes each one, So I'm sitting opposite people with their hands open. Sometimes they're trembling, sometimes they're sweating. They want something, they have an expectation. But it's a really incredibly intense kind of sense of trust and intimacy between strangers. Sometimes they take the paper and they walk away and they want to understand it, because I'd say there's a kind of poetic element to the way that I'm writing, but I don't respond. So there's a silence in the room, there's a silence between us, we never interact in a verbal way. So then I took a spot downtown in Lower Manhattan, and I ran a fortune-telling spot for 4 or 5 months through the winter. And I put fortune on the window, thinking maybe the cops would come and try to close me down. But I also don't publicize it as an artist. And so many people who came in really were coming in after work to have their fortune told. I'm not trying to make a kind of statement. I'm just trying to be with people in the street in a different kind of way. And also, I charge about $20 for the fortune. But that means that you're going home with a work by me for $20, and it's made about you. So in a way, I feel like it's a dissemination of work in a really meaningful way that doesn't have to do with market value, even though for many people who come in there, spending $20, you know, the bartenders who would come after work, that was actually commitment to spend $20. So, you know, I grew up in Lebanon. I left when I was 18, and I lived through the war, but I would go back to Lebanon very often because my parents stayed there, but I could never bring myself to make art there. I felt very damaged by the war experience, and I didn't really know what I would do there. And then I got invited to make a project for the National Museum of Beirut, which is an archaeological museum. They have ancient objects, and the thing about Lebanon is that museum was the Green Line in the Civil War. So it was bombed very, very badly, and the museum was bombed very badly, and so then it was renovated. So what I did was the idea was to make an artwork using the National Museum to make a contemporary artwork that would be in the forthcoming museum, which they were hoping to build, a contemporary art museum across the street. So I was thinking, how about sound? How about something where we basically bring the people from the street and have them come into the museum and create a kind of audio work, an audio guide for the museum, which is what we ended up doing. We brought in about 150 people in small groups and walked through the museum with them, and I would, in a very performance-like way, I would ask them each the same questions. Sometimes they would speak for the objects, and sometimes they would speak about the objects. And we created an audio guide that you can go to the National Museum of Beirut and walk through the museum and listen to the voices of the people from the street talking about the objects. The other thing is I chose to do it in Arabic, which is, in a colonial society like Lebanon, you know, the people who go to the museum mainly are people who speak French and English. That's the language of art. It's a power dynamic as well. And I decided, well, if this is for the people of Beirut and it's by the people of Beirut, it will only be in Arabic, so the people of Beirut can put their voices into the museum. This that I'm going to play right now, Shuhaida, by the way, means what is this? And I'm going to play something. So after I did the audio guide, which is at the museum, I then made a small video of some of the sounds that we collected, with a picture of what the object is. So I'll play that now.
بفتكر اجا جيل تاني، جيل جديد هو اللي اخذني وحطني بس حتى يفرجي للعالم الجديدة انه شو بتعمل الحرب بالانسان.
انا ما انكسرت، في حدا كسرني.
اكيد بحس حالي اني مظلوم.
حلما انا موجودة بهيدا البلد، مش حاسة حالي.
هلا بفتكر انا ما في احكي بقى لانه انا صرت هون بس تمثال، بس بقدر ساعد الناس من ورا شكل اللي صار من بعد الحرب.
فيني ساعد بالحكي على الاشياء اللي شفتها من قبل.
So in that, as you can see, in some cases they were speaking about the object, and in some cases they were putting on the voice of the object. This is the work that is in this really beautiful exhibition that I feel very happy to be a part of, and it's called When in the Course of Human Events. In 2019, there were protests across the world, in Chile, in Lebanon. People were in the street, and it felt like there was some kind of global action against oppression, And I was thinking, what is that moment when a person feels like it's time, that it's a pivotal moment in their life? I used the first line of the US Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary to. And I asked friends, activists, artists, poets, writers, people I knew, people I didn't know. I sent out letters. I said, just finish the sentence. And so I got hundreds of responses. And then I basically, I'm going to show some pictures of how it was made. So I took this microfiber paper, dyed it with black ink, pouring ink all over it. It was a very physical action, actually, which a lot of my paper-based pieces have a very physical kind of performance-like aspect. And then you can see how I then cut another layer, which is the strands of text. So you can see how the lines, they're attached as a second layer. When you see the work, you'll see that they stick out a little bit. And then I wrote people's responses, but it continues. So it's when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary to take a step back, to take a deep breath, to hold out your hands, to hold back your tears. After, I was really thinking a lot about how do our voices come together and what is the similarity across feelings? How is it that we feel like now is the time? And so then I decided to make a sound piece that doesn't accompany the work. It's a separate piece, but it's me reading this work. And I'm reading it in the first person. And at the same time, I asked people in Lebanon, I asked people across the world to send me sounds from the streets, from the protests, from the marches. And I was also recording myself as I was walking into my studio and my day-to-day life. So you'll hear, this is the sound piece, a part of it. It's actually 24 minutes long, but this is a minute of it.
I take a step back. I take a deep breath. I hold out my hands. I hold back my tears. I scream in the night.
I wait for the dawn.
I wait for the dawn.
I take to the streets.
I take to the streets.
I run for the hills.
I run for the hills.
I loosen my grip.
I loosen my grip.
It goes on, so I read the entire piece and you hear the sound of my day-to-day life interspersed with the sounds across the world. What's crazy about this is this show opened in January of 2020. By the time this closed, at our closing party, people were coughing, and within 2 weeks, we were in lockdown. I never could have imagined when I was making that piece how quickly things can change, which is really what the piece was about, that moment when things change. So we went into lockdown, but right before that, one of the things, I very often work with other artists and create collaborative projects, different spaces in New York. So I lived in this building that had this crazy lobby. It was an old building, and a lot of the people who had lived there in the 80s still lived there. It was a building where there had been a lot of drug dealing and gang fights and stuff, so it had a lot of people who had lived there through that. And I decided it would be interesting to try to do exhibitions in the lobby. But I could only convince the super that, because the lobby is an intermediary place where people leave things, they pick up their mail, they talk for a minute. It doesn't really belong to anybody. And so I asked the super, can I do exhibitions on Sunday afternoons for 4 hours? And so we did some really wonderful exhibitions, actually, and it was really joyous and great fun. And I'm not going to show the exhibitions, but you can see how crazy this lobby is. We made chess pieces, different artists came and did different things. And I decided it was time for me to do a project. And what I decided I would do was I would walk back and forth. I would invite different people to come and take a relay. I made some worry beads, that people use to worry or to count off their worries. And I thought it would be really interesting to walk back and forth for half an hour with somebody's concern on my mind. And then another person would come and I would whisper my concern, and then they would walk back and forth, and then another person, and we would do it for 12 hours. And we would do it from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m. because that's when people are most concerned. And it also made me think of that during the war, we all lived in the hallways of our apartments, and my father and many of the men would walk back and forth smoking and with their worry beads. And I was thinking, well, I'm going to subvert this. It's going to be a woman walking back and forth. It was my project. And I was thinking, about gender. I was thinking about roles. I was thinking about who worries. I had planned to do this in March of 2020, and I already had a whole list of people who were going to come. And every day I'd get a different text saying, are you sure? What about alcohol? Can we clean the things? People were getting more and more worried. And by the time we were about to do it, people were dying in New York. The helicopters were everywhere. No one was going to go anywhere. And even doing it in the lobby of the building seemed terribly cruel to do because there were a lot of old people and people were dying, and I thought people would be worried. So I decided to take everybody's worry myself, and I would walk for 12 hours overnight by myself in my apartment. And so these were the worry beads that I made, and I made one for every hour. And people sent me their worry, and they sent me the time. I gave them a time sheet so they could choose a time. That way I was live streaming it so they could watch me walk on Instagram Live, and they would know that I was worrying for them at the time that I gave them. So this was my little hallway, and I walked back and forth nonstop for 12 hours. I would stop to pick up the paper, read the person's worry, and then walk again. The only stopping was to read the worry. I never read it out loud, so nobody ever heard anybody else's worry. I just read it internally and then walked with it. And I feel like, in a way, I did it in March, and then I did it again in April. And because it was overnight, it was from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m., people could log on in the middle of the night and watch this. And I felt like it was a kind of way of having solidarity. It also made me think a lot about what is worrying, and can you really take on other people's worry, or can you just hold it in your hands to give them a little relief for a while? So it was called I Will Worry for You from Dusk Till Dawn. And by then this was COVID was in full swing, and I was alone in my studio. I was thinking about, what are the most important things? How do we think about what's important in a given month or a given day? Or a given year, and what is a year that's more important than another year? And everybody was saying, this is a year like no other. And so I decided to make a project called A Year Like Any Other. And I chose an event that happened. Every single day I'd choose an event that happened. Each one of these represents a month, and I would cut out, so the way that I chose the events, sometimes they were personal, sometimes they were things happening. A woman misses a train. A woman is sworn in as president. There was no location, no country, no specific place. I always started with the letter A. It's almost like a kind of, like a calendar, but also they were very physical. I was cutting them out, I was moving. It was like I was dancing, like I was actually physically working through it. I had this list of 365 events that I made the paper piece, and then I decided to make a video using the iPhone footage that I was filming in my little studio of myself locked up in this room. So this is January.
January 1, a million protesters take to the streets. January 2, a man who was making art dies. January 3, a drone strike kills a general. January 4, an invitation to an exhibition is received. January 5, a man recalls a photograph he took of a young woman once. January 6, a prolific serial rapist is sentenced to life in prison. January 7, a stampede takes place at a general's funeral. January 8, a plane is shot down shortly after takeoff.
So as you could see, I was really trying to think about what's important. What's the hierarchy of what's a year, what's left of a year? And when you look at the ruins of what we are, and we write the stories of what happened, what's going to be the thing that lasts? Like, what do we think is the important thing that happens? So after that, I started getting really interested in this idea of sound and of putting people's voices together. And so I was invited to be in an exhibition called In Search of the Miraculous. And I was thinking, how do we forgive ourselves? How do we actually find some kind of sense of peace or the miraculous. And so I started asking people, what do you forgive yourself for? Very often the way I do it is I'll send out a massive email to people I know and don't know. Then I'll ask people in the street. I'll just stop people and say, can I just ask you? And I'll collect all the sound. And very often I voice it myself, because a lot of it I get in writing as well. And all of these pieces are much longer. These are just excerpts. This plays from 3 different speakers. These are people's responses, and I'm voicing it.
I forgive myself for abandoning the child within me.
I forgive myself for abandoning the child within me for so many years. I forgive myself for being a bitch in high school.
I forgive myself for being a bitch in high school. I forgive myself for forgetting how grateful I should be for everything. I forgive myself for nothing. I forgive myself for nothing. I forgive myself for very little. I forgive myself for very little. I forgive myself for hurting my own mom. I forgive myself for hurting my own mom. I don't forgive myself for anything because I'm too young. I don't forgive myself for anything because I'm too young. I forgive myself for being a man.
What I found interesting about this is, and it goes on, is how people trusted me. And also I wondered very much how they actually felt doing it, because they seemed to want to share, actually. When we do things together, when we share even anonymously together, there's a sense of protection and there's a sense of power in being together, and also a kind of protection, a kind of being surrounded. So over the years, I'm really interested, you can see from A Year Like Any Other, about sentences that just begin with the same word. So I decided I wanted to steal poetry. These are called stolen lines. And for about a year, I would just pick up a line from a poem without really paying attention to who the writer was. But it would have to be a line that began with the word A. And it was just the lines. So whatever continued on the next line, I didn't go. So it was just fragments of lines. And then I cut them all out of this microfiber paper, this very thin paper that I've been using, which is the same paper that I've used for the piece upstairs. But that was a little heavier. This is very, very thin, as you can see. And then I attached them in ways to kind of create this terrain, this almost like a piece of fabric. And you can see some of the lines. Any way you read it, if you read them, you can read them any which way you want. It's almost like a terrain of poetry. I feel like in stitching them together, I'm creating something where people are alongside each other without really even knowing, because I don't even know who most of the poets are, and they don't know that they're there together. But there is something about this being kind of this almost residue of my reading in a way. And in the same show, I made a sound piece where I asked people what's left of us. And again, I voiced it. These are these paper nets made with the same kind of materials. They're almost like fabric. And then the speakers are actually cast out of paper. Skin and bones. Everything that's left. Will. Nothing. Love and small joys. Chaos mostly. Dust, thistles, energy, unraveled exploded eyes after a stroke. Not much. We grow stronger every day. Eros and Thanatos, baby. Love, all of it. Sadness and despair. Almost nothing. The salt of our tears. So the sound is people's response to what's left of us. In 2024, I was asked to be part of a billboard project in Beirut, where artists were given billboards and over the summer of 2024. And I was asked to do it. And so I was thinking a lot about, like, what do we own, what belongs to us? And so I cut out these 2 phrases, shu'ilak shu'ili, which means what is yours, what is mine. And my hope was that, that people would drive by and ask themselves, what is yours, what is mine? And I was really thinking about it with respect to, Lebanon has all these different factions and different experiences over the who owns what, who does the country belong to, really. Of course, little did I know that by the time my piece went up in September of 2024, Israel was bombing Lebanon. And so that became another question. I mean, of course, I had been thinking about Gaza too when I made this piece, but very sadly, this piece stayed up there in the middle of, it's very quiet as you can see, it stayed up straight through the war. It was supposed to stay up for 2 weeks and it stayed for 3 months because they couldn't take it down. But my thought was like how, you know, in a sense, it really is about sound because it's the sound in your head when you pass a question and then you start to ask yourself, well, what's an honest response to that? You know, what is really the honest response to what belongs to you? I mean, what really belongs to any of us, you know? And so I decided actually after that to continue with that idea, with that phrase. I made these pieces which are as close to an answer as I can think of as with respect to what belongs to me or what's mine, which is my memories, your memories, my struggle, your struggle, my shadow, your shadow, my dreams, your dreams, my silence, your silence, my freedom, your freedom. So each one of those phrases are cut in over and over again in that same paper. So it's almost like fabric, and they hang together on the wall like that. They move when you walk past them. They're very, very light. They're like very light nets. But also the microfiber paper is really quite strong, and it is paper, in fact. So from this, I thought I'd continue and show some of my newest work, which basically has become very much. This is another net piece. You can see the cuts, but that I've been dyeing them as well with ink. These are some of the small new ones that I've made over the past year or two. This is one of the lines. This says, "Our skin laid bare and our eyes bearing witness." And this was the last line that somebody gave me for What's Left of Us, but I had already made the sound piece. So I decided to actually cut it out instead. So this, I had said to her, I called her in Lebanon and I said, "What's left of us?" And she said, "Our skin laid bare and our eyes bearing witness." This is that piece. And this is what I'm working on now. So for the past 192 days, I've been cutting a piece every day. Basically, every one of them is a net piece that just says one day on it. And I'm also making a sound piece where I'm having people respond to that phrase or continue the phrase, one day, da da da. And what I think is interesting about one day is you can talk about the future and you can talk about the past at the same time. So as you can see, these pieces are each about this big. And so the squares that I'm cutting are about that big. And I have thousands and thousands of them. So I put a lot of them together. This work is in progress. I left it in the studio, but it's almost as big as this wall, or it is as big as this wall, this whole wall. And it's based on the Tower of Babel, which I've come to numerous times, maybe 4 or 5 times over the years. Every 5-10 years, I come and think about it as a structure, and thinking about language. But as you can see, there's language falling down. This is made from the squares cut out of the other piece, and they're put together with tape and then cut again. So you can see there, in some places you can see that they're whole, and then in some places you can see that they're cut out, and then there's also a kind of grid cut out behind it. Anyway, it's called Unspeak. And I want to conclude with another poet named Anne Boyer. Used the phrase unspeak in this essay that she wrote. I think it's kind of fitting. And thinking about Babel and thinking about going back to the very beginning of language, she says, "Saying nothing is a preliminary method of no. To practice unspeaking is to practice to being unbending, more so in a crowd. Cicero wrote, 'Come tacent clamant, in silence they clamor,' and he was right. Only a loudmouth would mistake silence for agreement. Silence is as often conspiracy as it is consent. A room of otherwise lively people saying nothing, staring at a figure of authority, is silence as the inchoate of a now initiated, 'We won't.'" I guess beginning with Oppen and the notion of our numerousness, of our choosing to be together, and are choosing to say no, is how I'll frame the beginning and the end of this. Yeah, and I'd love to hear your questions. I don't think that we're all similar. I think there's a lot of difference between all of us. But I also think that the intention to try to understand and the acceptance that misunderstanding is not violence. Misunderstanding actually opens up possibility of trying to understand. And it's been very interesting to me to have this work in Korea because I've had such incredible responses to it. In fact, I've had such incredible conversations when I came here. And it's an interesting thing to think about that because one, I made this in America based on the American Declaration of Independence, but I'm Lebanese. I speak 3 languages. I go between English, French, and Arabic all the time. And it's really interesting to see the work read here by people who don't have any of those experiences and very often don't speak the languages, and yet completely comprehend it. And not just that, actually sometimes read it in a more gentle, more understanding way than I encountered in the place where it was actually made. I think language is not simply meaning. Language is intention to try to share. And that requires courage. It requires courage to accept that you might be misunderstood and that misunderstanding can be fruitful in a way. Well, I think if you look at my work, you realize that I spend an average of 12 to 18 hours a day alone in a white room with nobody. It's interesting because I sometimes wonder why I make these paper pieces. But I think part of it is I really like the thing of being on my own in that kind of repetitive way. It doesn't bore me at all. I like the labor of it. I don't think I'm making the work for myself. I think even being alone in a solitary practice, you are with others. And so I think sometimes going down into the street and talking to strangers where there's not going to be a future conversation, we're not going to have any more of an exchange than which side are you on? The right side? Okay. We walk off. I will say for sure that even that small exchange changes my life. And I know when people walk off, even if it's a little thing, they're like, oh, what was that? And where will that be? And, and what did I say? For me, I'm not looking for the social by being in the street. To me, there is a solitariness to that as well. But like Oppen says, we choose to be numerous. We choose to be together. I was thinking today before I came here about the work, and I was thinking, people don't know me here. They might think that all my work is about politics or about difficult things or about war or about, But my work for me is about the intimate. It's about the body. And it's about how we move with our bodies through the world. And that is a dangerous experience. More and more dangerous in different contexts. I also grew up in a war. The war started when I was 8 years old, so that was my whole life. I think sometimes I feel maybe too comfortable with that because that is my childhood experience. I feel comfortable when there's turmoil and chaos, but I also feel that it's my responsibility to be aware of other people going through traumatic and difficult experiences. I'm very aware of the political situation. I really do think that my work is also about intimacy and love, really, and closeness. When I threw my paints away, I really thought, enough, what's the purpose sitting in your room making these paintings? They're going to go kill 1 million people, and you're paying for it with your taxes, and what does this matter? And do something, I feel completely differently now. I feel that the role of an artist is actually to stand against all of this. I think if we don't think creatively and differently and weirdly and strangely and upsettingly, then we're leaving the story of this life to people who will destroy everything. And I really do believe that it's fundamental right now. I didn't think that before, but it's taken me a long time to come to the place like the best thing about us as human beings is the way we can understand and misunderstand each other, and the way that we can accept each other and be together. And I do think that that's the role of the artist today, is to keep doing that, because if not, then what? Thank you all.